Episode 95 this week, Arsenal of Freedom. This was an alright episode for a season 1 episode. Some definite holes in the plot, but it was alright. Essentially, the Enterprise goes to a planet. They're looking for a ship called the Drake. They haven't heard from the ship in a while, so they go to investigate. They pull up to this planet, and when they get into orbit, they find out that there's no life forms on the planet, so they're wondering what happened to all the people. Data's like, oh yeah, they were arms dealers, and there was this giant world war. And LaForge was like, which side were they dealing arms to? And Data's like, well, both, of course. And then a message popped up on the view screen. They're like, who are you? How can you be there if there's no life? And this thing just kept talking. They finally discovered it was just a automated sales pitch trying to get them to buy the weapon systems. So Picard's like, okay, Riker, go down to the planet and see if anyone survived, even though there's clearly no life signs, no sign of a ship or anything like that that would indicate anyone from the Drake survived. And Riker's like, oh, okay. And he takes Tasha Yar and Data with him. They beam down there, and one of the automated weapon systems shows up, and it encases Riker in this cryogenic stasis field. So Data and Yar are like, how do we get him back to the ship now? We can't beam him out of there. So Picard's like, I'll bring Dr. Crusher and we'll come down there and figure it out. And they're like, okay. So Crusher and Picard beam down to the planet after Picard puts Geordi LaForge in charge of the Enterprise. And when Picard gets down there, first he's like, Data, can you get Riker out of there? And he's like, no. He's like, okay, I got it now. And he just instantly figured it out. And he's working on getting Riker out when another weapon system shows up. Picard grabs Dr. Crusher by the hand. He's like, let's get out of here. And they hightail it. The captain of the ship just beelining out of danger, leaving 2 officers to fend for themselves with the third one still in this force field. He just fled, just ran as fast as he could. Crusher hits this giant hole in the ground, which she didn't see apparently, even though it was like massive. And then she grabs Picard and she judo throws him over her. Picard takes a front flip bump. He was perfectly fine when he landed. 100% just fine. Dr. Crusher's got massive injuries, even though we didn't see how she really went down into this pit. But Picard's like, okay, we'll have to get out of here. And Crusher's like, I can't, I'm hurt. So Picard's trying to get her to help, say how to help her, trying to keep her awake because she makes a point of saying she has to stay awake. Then on the Enterprise, the weapon systems go into orbit. They want to blow up the Enterprise. The chief engineer of the week demands that LaForge relinquish command of the ship to him so he can run away and hide. LaForge is like, no, I'm in charge. And he's like, well, would Picard put you in charge if he knew this was going to happen? And LaForge is like, no, because he wouldn't have left the ship, dummy. And he makes the engineer go back to engineering. And they take this awful pounding. And then on the planet, they get Riker out of the force field, and they keep running into these weapons that they blow up, but there's 12-minute intervals between each one, and they keep getting more and more aware of what the strategy will be, so they're harder to defeat. And all this time, there's vague romantic tension between Crusher and Picard, but they barely do anything with that. It's just extremely vague. But then finally, on the ship, LaForge is like, we'll separate the ship, we'll send the saucer section to a star base, and I'll take the star drive in and we'll blow up that weapon system and get our people back. And the chief engineer is like, as long as I get to command something, I'm fine with it. He just wanted to command something. He didn't really care. So they do that, and then LaForge goes back to the planet after he'd escaped long enough to separate the ship. Riker and his people finally find Picard and Crusher. Data jumps down there. They find this view screen. Picard activates that, and a projection of the same salesman from before is there, and he's trying to explain how great the weapons were. Picard's trying to argue with them. All the computer knows how to do is to sell the weapons. They're not getting anywhere. And finally Crusher's like, it's a machine, just shut it off. And Picard's like, oh yeah. So he's like, okay, shut it off. You got to sell, we'll buy it. And then the hologram's like, oh good, okay. And he shuts it off. Except the one in space, which is fighting the Enterprise, which LaForge finally blows up. Figures out a way to confuse it. He blows it up. They beam the away team up. And LaForge's like, okay, I relinquish command back to you, Captain Picard. Captain Picard's like, no, I want my ship back in one piece because that's how I left it here. And LaForge's like, oh, okay. And they take off to go find the saucer section. That's pretty much Arsenal of Freedom. Some interesting notes in this one. It was without Wesley Crusher for the second straight week. No Wesley Crusher in this one. His mother, of course, in there. She referenced her grandmother being a healer and living with her grandmother. That comes into play in a season 7 episode, much later, but they touched on it here and went back to it. It's also one of the last episodes with Tasha Yar, security chief, and they were testing out Worf at the tactical station for replacing her in a few episodes. So it was Worf's first time at tactical. Well, pretty much episode 95.